The time is just gone 8:31 a.m. as we continue with the show this morning on News and Views. And we are now going to be joined by Professor Sandra Liebenberg, distinguished professor and H.F. Oppenheimer Chair in Human Rights Law at Stellenbosch University. Now, this comes against the background of the global pandemic and looking at human rights and why human rights should actually guide our responses to the pandemic. Professor Liebenberg, good morning to you. Welcome to the show.
Mr. Wadi, and good morning to your listeners.
Well, great having you with us this morning. Now, obviously, this is a very, very interesting discussion because, we are talking about human rights. We're talking of a value system. We're talking of equality, freedom, justice, and all these fancy terms that go along with human rights. Now, when we're looking at this pandemic in relation to human rights and how, human rights should actually feature at a time of the pandemic, and more importantly, in terms of what our response should be, Professor Sandra.
Yes, so thanks very much, Mr. Wadi. In a situation of crisis, human rights are often the first to go. Whether it's our freedom of religion, our freedom of movement, people being detained arbitrarily, so forth. And it's actually in times of crisis that human rights are the most valuable and the most useful because they really help government to put people at the center of their response and to realize that actually both their civil and political freedoms, but also importantly, their economic, social, and cultural rights must be protected. And I think the coronavirus pandemic has really shown us both aspects that yes, we have to restrict some rights in order to prevent contagion and contracting COVID, but we also have to protect people's economic livelihoods and provide them with social protection.
Well, if we look at this, Professor Sandra, and let's just look at South Africa as an example, because we are living in South Africa,
Yes.
and these last 5 or 6 months, and when we apply practically these human rights values, what would your assessment be, or in your analysis, do you think enough has been done to protect people's human rights at a time of crisis?
Thank you. I think the two aspects that I would be concerned about is we saw, particularly in the lockdown, some very heavy handed police action in enforcing the lockdown regulations. The killing of Collins Causa, I think, was one of the cases that really epitomized, this heavy handed action of the police at a time when you actually need to build people's cooperation with the authorities in responding to the pandemic. I would also question, whether some of the regulations were strictly necessary. One thinks, for example, of the smoking ban, how extensive it was and what it led to in terms of the black market in cigarettes and so forth. The other aspect I would be concerned about is just the extent of the suffering and poverty. And yes, government did well to enact, the COVID relief fund, the TERS unemployment. I mean, they put many elements in place which one has to commend them for, but there are many gaps and many people fell through those gaps, and I don't need to tell the station the extent of hunger and suffering we have seen. So I think there really needs to be an investment into ensuring that no one falls through those gaps.
Yes, I think one of the points that you've made here, Professor, is also the approach and a holistic approach, an integrated approach. But in this integrated approach, it is also about taking responsibility. It is also about being accountable. And I think this is where The big issue comes in, or the major issue comes in, is how accountable has have governments in general been in their response to this pandemic.
Yes, thank you. I mean, this is a critical point that you highlight of accountability, and this is what the human rights framework gives you because it says that no right is worth the paper it's written on if you don't have a remedy, an effective remedy for violations of those rights. So we are fortunate in South Africa, so we have had some important cases upholding accountability. I mentioned in the article the case saying that all school children should receive their daily school meals, regardless if they're in school or not. But I think the Collins Causer case also showed that some of our accountability institutions, like the Independent Police Complaints Directorate, is not necessarily functioning as effectively as it should. So that framework of accountability, because if people don't see accountability, they lose confidence in the state and its enforcement, and they will take the law into their own hands. And I think globally, this has also been a problem with authoritarian governments that don't necessarily put human rights at the center of their responses.
Yes, and also what we have been seeing is the constitution of the country being put to a test. And we've seen a number of cases come up where, when one looks at some of the regulations, the lockdown regulations, disaster management, and the like, and how it had actually stood up to the constitution, and particularly looking at it from a human rights perspective.
Yes, a very, very important point because, with the national state of disaster and the regulations under it limited a number of rights under our Bill of Rights in order to protect other rights, like the right to life and the right to health. And the Bill of Rights says that in limiting rights, you shouldn't go further than is strictly necessary to achieve the objective. So there has to be like a balance in the measures adopted, and there has to be safeguards in place to ensure that people's rights are protected and balanced in a fair way. And our courts have looked at this issue. They've rejected a number of challenges to lockdown regulations, but they've also upheld other challenges. I mentioned already the school feeding scheme case, and there's still some cases which are wending their way through the courts. But this is where, again, it's so important when government limits rights to see, it is a tricky balancing act. You think, for example, of freedom of religion, how the restrictions that were put on it and are those proportionate and they go no further than is necessary. But it's also a mistake not to protect the right to life effectively. So there do need to be some restrictions.
Well, and just finally, Professor Liebenberg, what's important is what lessons have we learned from this experience in the last few months? Because there's always this talk of a second wave, and we see it globally, the second wave, and God forbid that we go through this and we get over this pandemic as soon as possible. But should if this happen, what lessons would we have learned, going forward, and if we are hit by the second wave?
Yes, I'm sure that there are very many lessons, but I think going forward, the most crucial thing we have a number of health preparedness now and a number of systems in place to cope with the pandemic. But I think we do need to work on our economic and social programs. We need to ensure that if we need to impose another lockdown, people do not go hungry, that there is an effective response, and going long term, the issues that are well known of unemployment is a major issue. We need to build our social security programs out so that if there is a lockdown, that people can survive and they can recover, because in the long term, that's going to be most critical to our democracy and whether the Constitution means anything to people in their real day-to-day lives.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for that and for your time with us this morning. We wish you all the best. Take care.
Thanks very much. Good morning.
Professor Sandra Liebenberg joining us this morning. We're going to go for a quick break. We'll be back.